Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to hand over now to Emily Cowan, who's joining us from SINTEF Ocean, and we're very excited to hear from you this morning about the UN treaty and what that will mean for plastic governance. So, Emily, when you're ready, you can bring up your slides.
That's great. Yes, well, first and foremost, thank you so much for inviting me into this webinar series. And I'm going to be speaking specifically on governing plastics on the UN Treaty to End Plastic Pollution. So I work as a research scientist, as was said, at SINTEF Ocean in Trondheim, Norway, and I work in the realm of political and social sciences. So I'm currently trying to finish my PhD, and within that, I'm working on following the global plastic treaty negotiations. So I'll get a little more into my methods and what I do later on in this presentation. But first and foremost, I wanted to give a brief overview and framing of the issues that we're looking at here when it comes to plastic pollution. So the triple planetary crisis, this is basically the golden phrase at any global negotiations. And it really refers to these three main interlinking issues we have that humanity and the environment currently face when it comes to climate change, pollution, also biodiversity loss. And each of these issues have their own causes and effects that need to be resolved if we want to have a viable future on this planet. But the key part is that each of these crises, they're transboundary in nature and they're very much interlinked and interconnect, meaning it's not up to just one nation or region to solve these issues on their own. It must be taken up at the global level. So when it comes to the plastics problem specifically, we're really finding that our production is reaching unsustainable amounts. And I'm sure a lot of us in this webinar have heard a million times that a truckload of waste is dumped into our oceans every minute. We find articles that it's ending up in our blood. Research is showing that it's disrupting our endocrine systems. But don't get me wrong, plastics are an extremely useful product in our modern society. We're never going to be able to fully live without them. But what we really have to do is understand how and better produce, design, and ultimately not have plastics ending up as waste. So let's get into it. We are talking about governance here, and specifically multilateral environmental agreements, or MEAs as they're known. And these are agreements between at least 3 or more states that assist and address environmental issues at the global level, but of course that needs to reach down to regional, national, and even local levels. So some examples of these we can think of are the Montreal Protocol from the late 80s. This was an instance where nations came together to ban harmful chemicals from enlarging a hole in the ozone layer. It was highly successful and very much based on scientific evidence and being a top-down treaty formation. Another example of this, we can think of the Paris Agreement, a bit more recent, but also less legally binding, where nations agreed to limit warming temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what we see here with the Paris Agreement is that nations kind of sign on to this, and it's voluntary agreements to do this. So it'll be interesting to see what the Global Plastic Treaty will finally come to be. But this problem is only growing. I know lots of us have these images in our mind of our oceans just drowning in plastics. And I say ocean as it is a transboundary issue that knows no border. So whether you live in a more tropical climate or the high north, we're all affected by the growing crisis. And the most recent numbers are at least 450 million tons of plastic products produced each year, and we're really unable to continue on as business as usual. We need a treaty. But first, I would like to start with a metaphor. Make sure you're all with me this morning, not too tired. And so here we have a picture of Sisyphus, or at least an interpretation of the Greek mythology about Sisyphus. And so for those of you who aren't aware of the story, I'll give you kind of the Cliff Notes version. Basically, he was a king who cheated death multiple times, and he was ultimately condemned by Zeus to continue to forever be rolling a boulder up a hill, only every time right before he reaches the top, the boulder falls down, only for him to have to continue to roll it up again with this fate and dread of hopeless endless eternity. And I don't know about you all, but I like to compare this myth to what we've been told the last decades, that we can just recycle our way out of the plastic problem, and thinking that recycling is the only answer we have, when that's really just left us with a much larger pollution problem that we know can't be solved by recycling on its own. And so this has just left us trying to get up that hill, beat plastic pollution, only to fall down with the very high numbers of production that keep rising. Now, cleanup methods are very important and we need them, but to truly beat plastic pollution, we have to understand our production, consumption, and disposal on land first. And to date, when we look at the current regulatory responses to our pollution, um, they're very fragmented at best. So we really want to understand how we can better frame the problem and also have a very impactful global treaty. And so one way that I like to think about this problem is a full systems approach, looking at the entire life cycle of a plastic product. And so how we do this, and how the treaty wants to look at it as well, is thinking of the problem from the moments that we extract a material, from when it's processed and manufactured, to also moving down how companies choose to design products to be better and use less materials, use materials that are more easily recycled and put into the circular economy, as well as how we package and distribute products. I don't know about you all, but one thing that I can't stand is whenever I see food that has its own natural packaging, like a banana or an orange, and then it's just wrapped in plastic. So unnecessary. But food waste is a major problem, but not all our food needs to be packaged in so much plastic. So we really need to figure out how to better go about doing this, and understanding how we distribute, use products, and then eventually moving down to the end of life and reuse phase. That's what a full life cycle approach really means. And we can think of this diagram moving from upstream to midstream to downstream processes of a single plastic product, but a global treaty is really going to require a full systems change, including large and transnational companies. We need financial institutions equipped with monitoring, assessment, and transparency to disclose how much plastic we're using, where it's going throughout the entire value chain. So what is the solution to pollution? Well, I hope by now you've heard that although cleanup is important, it's not the one-stop only solution that's needed. We need a full life cycle approach. We can start by transitioning away from single-use items, which take up or make up about 40% of the litter found in and around beaches, and that global regulation is needed. But unfortunately, we might know that the policymaking process is very slow moving. It requires the consensus of at least 100 different countries who have varying points of views and ambitions. It's a very fine line to walk between having too strict of requirements where nations don't want to sign on, or being too vague and not having meaningful and enforcing requirements in a treaty. However, since this agreement is expected to be finished in less than 2 years now, it would make it the fastest environmental treaty to date. So it's really important for us to document and understand how this process came to be, to help with future negotiations as well. So let's get into the process of what happened. We have the United Nations Environmental Assembly, which was established in 2012. It's known as the world's highest level decision-making body on the environment, and it falls under UNEP, or the United Nations Environmental Program, which is headquartered in Nairobi. And this is really where the mandate for the treaty came to be that we're currently negotiating. So this happened the 5th time that UNEA was convening. It was actually the 5th and a half time. It's called UNEA 5.2 because it happened during the COVID pandemic. The first time was online, but whenever we were able to meet again in March of 2022, that's where our mandate came to be. But this didn't just happen out of the blue within 2021, 2022 timeframe. It really started at UNEA back in 2014, whenever the harmful effects of marine plastic pollution was put on the agenda, and it just continued to grow until we had the UNEA 5.2 session. And so what happened here that allowed us to have the mandate to begin negotiations? Well, it started with 3 different resolutions that were presented the week before the UNEA session at the Open-Ended Committee of Permanent Representatives. And so there were 3 resolutions that came about there that had to be looked at and examined by all of the member states. The first one came from Rwanda and Peru. This is the one that thankfully won out among the others and has the most text from. It's also the most legally binding measures that came about in the draft resolution. There was also one being negotiated from Japan, which focused it mainly on the plastics in the marine environment. That was signed on as well by countries that were major plastic producing nations. And then finally, at the very end, we had a curveball from India who wanted immediate voluntary measures and focusing just on single-use plastics. But in the end, we know that we did get a mandate on a resolution entitled End Plastic Pollution Towards an International Legally Binding Instrument. And as I know there's many of us here who work within the field of science, maybe you're researchers or you're going to university, there's a specific paragraph in the mandate that includes the need for science in the decision-making process within this treaty. So stressing the urgent need to strengthen the science policy interface at all levels and really improve our understanding of what the global impacts of pollution are on the environment and how we can make this treaty really effective. So what does the timeline for the negotiations look like? Well, of course, we had UNEA 5.2 with the mandate last March. That moved onto an open-ended working group, which met in Senegal to kind of set up the rules of the game, how long we need to negotiate, which looks like this graphic here. The first round of negotiations, which I'll get into soon, met at the end of November in Uruguay. And this graphic is getting a little pushed back now. We're currently at this first arrow in the intersessional period between the first INC and the second, which now will be pushed back to the end of May. But what I really want to point out as well is that once our treaty is negotiated, we're going to have to make sure that nations implement that into their national laws. And then it will become a COP. And so you've probably heard of the climate change COP or the biodiversity COP, COP27, COP15. It really just means conference of parties. So once this treaty is negotiated, we'll also have a plastics COP. But what is my work specifically here attending these treaty negotiations? What sort of methods and theories do I use? I use something called orchestration theory. And here we have a lovely picture of an orchestra conductor, but this is not the exact type of orchestration I'm referring to. So us political scientists, we love a good theory. And in this case, with my research, I utilize Abbott and Schneidel's theory of orchestration, which is understanding the actors at play in attempt to achieve a target. So it's this OIT method. So we have an orchestrator. In the case of the mandate, we have that as UNEA. Whenever we're talking about the negotiations now and the ink, we can see UNEP as an orchestrator here. And it's really a way to understand how different intermediaries are at play to govern a target. and our target being a legally binding treaty with a full life cycle approach. So we argue in our research that whenever its orchestration is properly conducted, it can overcome typical fragmented governance by working not only through member states, but also intermediaries in the policymaking process. So how are we able to see and visualize these intermediaries? Well, of course, we can see them through media. We have a lot of influence on solving plastic pollution through this representation, whether it be through the research community who document the environmental effects and fates of plastics, or NGOs also doing amazing work on advocating for change and providing sort of guidelines that we need to see, or even civil society um, campaigning for less plastic pollution and harsher fines for environmental damage in their local communities. And we even see big brands in the media calling for kind of a cut to plastic production and asking help at the global level on how to better regulate themselves. But how are we able to examine the roles of all of these actors in forming a global treaty? Well, that's where my main work comes into play. My amazing colleagues and I have the opportunity to be observers and go in the negotiation rooms. And we use a methodology called event ethnography to follow the negotiations closely and understand how they're formed, how these different intermediaries work through each other to have a target of a legally binding treaty. So I'm creating a database when I go to these negotiations, documenting and ethnographically recording who is saying what. So I want to know which member state is speaking. Are they speaking on behalf of a like-minded group, or is it maybe a stakeholder group who's giving input at these negotiations? I also want to know, what are these organizations advocating for or against within the negotiations? I want to know, when do their interjections take place? Could it be in a session that's discussing the circular economy, or one that's discussing financial mechanisms? And then I want to know, where do the negotiations happen? So at these ink processes, we have plenary sessions, which is open to all observers, all member states. We're able to say who said what, but there's also informal sessions and informal sessions. And as an observer, I'm able to attend those, but I can't document or publicly write who said what during it. So we're ethnographically recording everything, as I mentioned here, that takes place during the negotiations to eventually reach the how. And that's where you can all come in. Our ultimate goal after the treaty is negotiated is to submit a global database open to everyone, policymakers, researchers, the public, and we hope that it can contribute to this science policy interface process while also aiding future policymakers to fully understand sort of power struggles that happen during negotiations, and ultimately they can decipher on their own how the end text was achieved. So without further ado, let's get into what happened at the first negotiations. And I want to start with a quote from an NGO major group that said, "We will judge the treaty not on what it promises, but on what it does." And this is to really mention the importance of stakeholder groups when it comes to the negotiations. And so these treaty negotiations and also our own research project show us that it's no longer an option to include stakeholders. Um, they're not just nice to have in projects, they really validate our results and future pathways forward for a global treaty. So these can include anyone from NGOs, media, industry, producers working in the supply chain, investors, managers, even youth, the future leaders. They all have an influence or can be influenced by the outcomes of a global treaty. So it's important that their voices are also heard. I think at least those working in research, a lot of the times we work on a project or a problem for years, and we think we know every angle and facet of our project, but we really need the help of these stakeholder user groups to uncover and minimize risk that might come up whenever the treaty is negotiated. So let's get into what happened in Uruguay. The week began actually on Saturday with a roundtable stakeholder session, and I was actually lucky enough to be able to facilitate one of these tables of stakeholders, which range from NGOs to waste pickers to scientists to member state delegates. And I was asked to facilitate with the following questions in mind of what are the actions required to achieve a circular economy and close the loop within the global treaty, and what would be required to accelerate said actions. So we got together at the plenary midweek and really discussed what some of these main topics that the stakeholders said during these roundtable sessions. And I summarized a few of them here. So some of them were that we really need to think about within these negotiations, if a product goes on the market, it's really important that the producers have the responsibility to make sure countries that they sell a product to can handle the waste that they're creating. A big one was to use the precautionary principle. Science can, of course, guide and strengthen the treaty after we go into COPs, but we know enough now to act and create a treaty. Another aspect that was important for the stakeholders was that we really need strict requirements for monitoring and transparency throughout the entire value chain of plastics. Right now, we really don't know the exact amount of materials that we produce and where it's going throughout the value chain. So that's an important facet of our treaty. And finally, we really need to have a common definition of the terms we're using when it comes to circular economy or polluters pay or aspects of the life cycle approach, whether upstream, midstream, or downstream. During these negotiations, it's important that we all have the same playbook to negotiate by. So what actually happened during the negotiations? Well, something a bit funny. I want to make sure you're all still with us. Never before would I think it would be possible to watch the World Cup with delegates from over 100 nations, but that's exactly what happened on the final day of the conference after the morning plenary. It was actually Uruguay, the host country. They played Ghana, and I got to watch with delegates from around the world, observe and enjoy the game together. It was a really interesting experience. But in all seriousness, at this first round of negotiations, a committee was elected. We had many hours of national statements, so understanding member states' points of views, like-minded groups' points of views, and major group stakeholder statements on what they want to see within the treaty. And then finally, a plan forward was made for what's going to happen at the second round of negotiations and also following the next 2 years. So the focus was really on the environmental impacts, the hazards and risk, making sure we use a life cycle approach, and very much so a humans rights-based approach when it comes to the negotiations. So what does the path forward look like? There's very limited time before the end of May, whenever the second round of negotiations start. And therefore, delegates and stakeholders are going to need to work very efficiently and effectively during this intersessional period to make progress and be ready and prepared to start real negotiations during the spring. And so a clear consensus was made of what will start at the second round of negotiations, and that is dividing into 2 separate negotiating groups. So the first one would be focusing on the objectives of the treaty, what the scope is, sort of control and implementation measures it might have. And what came up here was having national action plans. And some countries wanted to have this alongside sort of legally binding top-down measures, and other countries were seemingly advocating for, well, we just want national action plans. We don't want any global plan. So it'll be very interesting to follow and see how that plays out in next round and the following rounds of negotiations. The second group is going to focus on how we're going to implement a treaty, what are the sort of institutional arrangements and other potential elements that the treaty might include. And so, like any treaty, we're going to have mixed measures from both legally binding, voluntary measures, but whatever we have at the global level, it's going to need to reach the regional, national, and local level as well. So what does that look like in practice of multi-level governance? How can we examine this? Well, we have examples from the global level. We can think of MARPOL's Annex 5, which bans waste disposal from ships at the seas. We also have other regional level regulations that come from small island developing states banning plastic bags. We also have the EU single-use plastic ban as a regional governance mechanism. At the national level, there's also many examples. One of the most recent ones I found is the UK just issued a packaging tax. So for products manufactured or imported to the country, if they contain less than 30% recycled contents, they have a tax here. And then finally, at the local level, we can see beach cleanups or locals advocating for better waste facilities that come up. Of course, all of these are very downstream, so I'd like to see more measures that take up the upstream side of plastics life cycle. What are some sort of policy measures that UNEP might want to see in the negotiations? Well, we could have bans or restrictions, and these can prohibit or control a product coming on the market. An example of that would, of course, be the EU single-use plastic ban, banning the 10 most found on beaches single-use plastic products. Another policy instrument could be the EPR scheme or Extended Producer Responsibility Scheme, which really shifts the cost from onto producers to design better products from the start. Examples of this could be a mandate take-back program on products. And then another policy instrument we could see are taxes, tariffs, or fees. And an example from this that you might have heard about are a tax on virgin materials, virgin plastic pellets to make products. As recycled materials, they're currently at least 10 times more expensive than the virgin plastic pellets. There's also a call from the science community on quotas on how much plastic we're producing as well. So these are sort of different policy instruments we're looking at and are interested to see how they are negotiated and worked in a treaty. But before I end today, I just want to mention how important it is that we all can and should provide knowledge to the policymaking process. So from the top level, when it comes to UNEP, if you're not an observer at the negotiations, they're also creating a science policy panel to contribute to the management of chemicals and waste to prevent plastic pollution. This is kind of a sub-side of the plastic treaty. A more ad hoc approach would be the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastic Treaty. And this is where scientists from around the world are encouraged to join, who are expertises in their field of plastics and provide input to policymakers and negotiators throughout the treaty negotiations. So what this looks like, you might have seen it as this scientist declaration, which came before UNEA 5.2. It was also called the SNEPT Group, the Scientist Network on an Effective Plastic Treaty, but they recently changed their name to the Scientist Coalition. And it's really a network to mobilize experts within the field, engage the wider public and policymakers during negotiations, and make sure we don't have a weakened treaty. But there's also some other positive initiatives happening at the global level. You might have heard of the High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution. And each time I check this coalition, I feel the numbers are continuing to grow, which is great. It's currently made up of 51 UN member states and negotiators in the plastic treaty negotiations. And they're really pushing forward for a legally binding, meaningful treaty. So I put some tips and tricks on where to find this info that I just discussed, but at the same time, there's so many good research papers, reports, and depending on what your expertise lies in, whether it's more the social or political or governance side of plastic or natural science side, I would be happy to send you some recommendations on further reading. But that's all for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Emily. It sounds like you've had a very, very interesting experience conducting your PhD, and that must be an incredible experience chairing the or facilitating the roundtable discussion at the UN. I don't see any questions or comments in the Q&A box or in the chat yet, but please feel free to send those through. In the meantime, Emily, are there any specific major barriers that you foresee over the course of the next while they're looking to finalize the treaty? Would it, yeah, any specifics that you can provide there? Would it be related more to sort of governments and getting countries on board, or would it be sort of agreeing on the best course of action? For example, bans can be quite, yeah, they can be a bit polarizing.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a bit of both. From the more making sure we have countries on board, I think whenever we talk about legally binding top-down measures, countries that are maybe major producers of plastic materials, they're a bit hesitant to want to sign on board to that, as it could take away a major part of their economy if that comes into action. But as well, another barrier we're seeing at the negotiations is sort of stakeholders, maybe some groups not being so happy that there's industry, oil and gas producing nations there who are part of stakeholder groups in the negotiations. So that's a bit of, it's something you see in the background going on. But yeah, it's interesting to follow. It's not so much happening at the first round of negotiations, but I guarantee that it will in the next year and a half.
Okay, interesting. I think there's often a bit of controversial nature around that and who all gets to be at the table, but realistically, you do need everyone's buy-in. So
exactly.
That's very tricky. I see there are a few questions that have come through. The first says, what happens to the taxes? Can it be stipulated that it's channeled into cleanup organizations or monitoring efforts?
That could be possible, but it hasn't been decided yet, and it's also really hard. How are we going to have a global tax? Where is it going to go? Is it going to go to a global fund and be monitored there through possibly UNEP, or will it have to be more on the regional level or national level where nations decide themselves where it goes? So that's a very interesting point that I want to follow.
Okay, and I suppose even then, if it's operating on a national level, will it be the country that's importing it? Will it be the country that's exporting? There's
exactly. We don't know yet.
Okay. And then the next question is saying, thanks for the interesting presentation. It was really enjoyed. When you presented on the policy instruments, I noticed that there was no focus on social instruments, but rather on direct regulations and economic instruments. Is there a bit of a gap there?
That's true. Yes, specifically when it comes to the policies within the negotiation, we see it being more kind of regulatory top-down approaches from the start. But I would see sort of social policy mechanisms coming in at the regional level, because it's going to depend on where you are, what sort of social mechanisms you need, because it's not the one size fits all.
Just to jump on to Patrick's question there, you mentioned obviously that there are a number of sectors, whether it's sort of the production, the consumption, or the disposal, that we focus on. The pyramid that you showed, giving examples of the sort of national and regional and local levels of sort of interventions. Would you say that that focuses more on the consumption sector, and are efforts being made to produce similar guiding instruments for the production and the disposal sectors?
Yes, so unfortunately right now, most of our regulation is just focused on downstream. And that's one of the reasons why we need this global treaty to figure out how can we implement measures at place upstream. And so as I mentioned, there was a call from the science community to cap global productions of plastics, which I think is really important and it is needed, but from more of a social perspective, I think it's really important even within that to think about what the full life cycle of that means. If we cap production, does that mean that we're making sure certain industries are capped, or countries, or what happens with countries who don't produce products, but maybe they very much rely on them? How do we make sure they get the products that we need? So in every aspect of this treaty, we have to look at all facets.
Certainly. And I mean, even sort of different communities within a single country, there will be such vast differences in the needs for different plastic items.
Exactly.
Then we have another question that says, great talk, Emily. My question is how these action plans will account for implementation. We have plenty of great laws in South Africa, but they are not really enforced.
I think that is a major issue on any treaty, on how do we make sure it's enforced, and something that I personally really want to see within these negotiations are having something from the top, but then we implement it at the regional level, and we can establish sort of regional implementations, whether it be for Europe, or they can report back, and we have sort of enforcement mechanisms where they can do that at the regional level, which then reports to the global level. So we're kind of double checking throughout the process that it's being implemented, and it's not just being checked up at the global level.
Are there any similar treaties that have been constructed and are operating on a global scale that serve as an example for this?
They are, as I mentioned, the Montreal Protocol, but there's nothing at this scale of plastics. They're everywhere in our society. And when it came to the Montreal Protocol, I think we banned 10 harmful chemicals. And here we're just looking at an entire systems change. So we haven't had a treaty on this level, on this scale, with something so integrated into all of our lives.
It's definitely an admirable task, and definitely not a simple one.
No.
There's a comment here saying in Spain, cigarette manufacturers are taxed and money is used for cleanups, if they're not mistaken. It's definitely an interesting model, a bit of an extended producer responsibility concept there.
Yeah, the question when it comes to plastics is, are we going to tax our local supermarket for selling us the products, or are we going to tax the manufacturers that they buy the plastic products from, or are we going to tax the ones who are extracting the raw materials? It's understanding who is at large here when it comes to plastics.
And where the responsibility lies in quite a long chain. There's another comment here that says the treaty will need to be properly administered. If it just goes into a national government fiscus, it would get redirected, and the finances need to go into the control of plastic pollution. I think that's definitely a point everyone will agree on. It's more, I think, the mechanisms in place that makes it tricky.
Exactly.
And then there's a question saying, when you say regional level, is that the level between global and national, or subnational?
It's the level between global and national.
Okay, so for example, in Africa, South Africa is part of the WIOMSA region, so the Western Indian Ocean countries. Would that be an example of the regional scale?
I was thinking more of the like-minded groups that we have at the negotiations. So we have the African group or the small island developing nations, those who are very like-minded in their issues of the problem and what they're facing, so they can work together at the regional level and report there to report back to the global level.
Okay. And slightly along that vein, you mentioned that there are some opposing goals, as some are looking to sort of join part of a global treaty and others are looking to develop a national or regional action plan. Is there a lot of intersection between those, that sort of how perhaps advising how their national plans could work within the treaty?
So far, we don't know about that. I expect it to be brought up more at the second round of negotiations, but this first round, it was mainly, we're a bit wary of these legally binding measures that we don't know what it might include, so we would prefer just taking it in at the national level and deciding on our own what to do. But I expect this dialogue to have changed throughout this intersessional period, and hopefully we understand more about what is meant by these national action plans.
Okay. I see we're getting little bit close to 12, but so perhaps you
Oh,
can,
yeah.
if anyone does have any questions at a later time, you're welcome to email those through and we'll pass those along to Emily. But
Yes.
in perhaps as a closing question, depending how we do for time, you obviously we spoke about the different major sectors and the disposal, and obviously different countries will have different waste value chains. I know South Africa's is quite complicated and long with the sort of waste reclaimers involved. And I know you mentioned that they were at the roundtable that you facilitated in Uruguay. Are there any specific stakeholders who've been identified for the next round of talks?
No, so it was actually talked about, are we going to have this stakeholder roundtable discussion again at the next round of negotiations? Some nations wanted to do that. It kind of seemed as a tactic to maybe not have so much intense negotiations, but there was talks on maybe having stakeholder sessions at the regional level, and those can again report to the global level, and maybe not a full day's worth of talk on stakeholders, because we only have 1 week each during these negotiations, and that's an extremely short time period. So yeah, that's will be something to watch as well.
Okay, and so after the upcoming the second talk that's coming up, what will the following steps be after that?
It depends on what was established at the second round, but we'll have another intersessional period where stakeholders can give their feedback, member states can give their feedback on what they want to see within the third round of negotiations. And then we'll go to the third round, but it all depends on what happens at the end of May.
Okay, I see. Yeah, it sounds very exciting and a very, very interesting position to be in. Yeah, so I think we've run out of time slightly here, but thank you so much, Emily, for joining today. I think it's quite an ambitious goal, and I think for those who aren't involved in the social and political sector, it can be quite hard to wrap one's head around, especially considering all the different role players and all the different regions and all the different aspects that are looking to be covered by this one treaty. So it's really great to hear your take on it and the way that you've broken it down to make it easily digestible.
Well, thank you so much for having me today.
I see there's a comment in the chat saying thanks for the interesting presentation and discussion. If anyone does have any questions at a later stage, perhaps watching the recording, you're welcome to email us at webinars@sscafrica.org.za and we'll pass those along. I think we can end off the session here for today, though. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And again, thank you so much, Emily. We, I'm sure, are all waiting eagerly to hear what happens at the next round of negotiations in May.
Yes. You and me both.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And please remember to join us next week for the third session in our series. We'll be hearing from Professor Yusuf Isa from the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He's going to be talking about thermochemical solutions for plastic waste. So please join us for that. Registration links can be found on the SST events page if you haven't already registered. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. And thank you again, Emily.
Thank you.